right, you're watching Live Now. I'm Austin Westfall. We continue to track the latest in Iran, the military buildup continuing, and the U.S. expanding its options as the USS Gerald R arrives to the Middle East. President Trump telling reporters today that he is, quote, not happy with the way Iran is negotiating, saying they're not willing to give us what we have to have. The president also told reporters that he had yet to make a final decision on striking Iran, something that many are speculating could occur in the near future. Here's what Trump said earlier today in Texas.
Well, they should make a deal, but they don't want to quite go far enough, and it's too bad. Look, we've been playing with them for 47 years, and that's a long time. They've been blowing the legs off our people, blowing the face off our people, the arms. They've been knocking out ships one by one. But every month there's something else, so you can't put up with it too long. We're not happy with the negotiation. They just don't want to. They don't want to say the key words. We're not going to have a nuclear weapon. They have to say we're not going to have a nuclear weapon, and they just can't quite get there. They want to enrich a little bit. You don't have to enrich when you have that much oil. So I'm not happy with the negotiation. Well,
President Trump saying that earlier today. We will let you know if we hear more from the White House or from Secretary of State Marco Rubio as the weekend progresses. Standing by right now is retired Marine Intelligence Officer and host of the Strap podcast, Hal Kempfer. Hal, we put the call out to the viewers to send in their questions about this situation. A lot of people are curious about where this goes from here and about some of the decision-making going on behind the scenes. Warren is in Michigan. He says, is Trump close to striking Iran? I feel this weekend it's going to happen. What do you think, Hal? What's the likelihood we do see something this weekend?
I think there's a high likelihood that we could see some sort of military action beginning as early as this weekend, definitely within probably this week, unless something dramatic happens on the diplomatic front, which I can't see right now. Right now, what you're hearing is the language from the president indicating he's very frustrated with the response he's getting from the Iranians and kind of setting the predicate, if you will, for why we would be striking and making that pretty clear. Now, I should probably point out at various times, officials from Iran have said that they do not intend to get a nuclear weapon. But then as soon as they say that, we find out that they're quietly enriching uranium up to near weapons grade capabilities, and they're doing a lot of other things which indicate that whatever they say really can't be taken at face value. So it's more than just the words. They actually have to demonstrate that they're really not going to do that, and that would be a fairly significant negotiation, and that just doesn't seem to be in the cards.
So you and I have been tracking the movements of the USS Gerald R in recent weeks. It was in the Caribbean. The U.S. had placed it there in anticipation of the operation that eventually nabbed Nicolas Maduro. Then it was reassigned to the Middle East. It did arrive just off the coast of Israel. Earlier today, I was seeing some video from Reuters showing it arriving. Now that the carrier is in the Middle East, Hal, is it going to stay near Israel? Do we have any level of clarity on if it's going to park itself there? And if so, does the aircraft carrier function as sort of a tripwire, if you will, ensuring that any potential retaliation that might be aimed at Israel would also inevitably involve American forces because the aircraft carrier's proximity?
Well, potentially. One of the reasons you'd have naval forces off in the eastern Mediterranean near Israel would also be to augment the air defense capability of the Iron Dome if or when Israel was to come under attack from ballistic missiles and drones coming in from Iran. So that would be another reason. But the carrier is in the theater of operations. It is not as close as it could be. And that kind of goes to the question of, would they move this any closer? If they did, they'd have to move it away to the west, take it through the Suez Canal, and then take it out the Red Sea through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and to the Gulf of Aden. That would have it skirting right around the Houthi territory of Yemen. And of course, the Houthis would certainly probably try to take it under fire with anti-ship missiles and drones and everything else. So there might be a very good reason why they just as soon keep it where it's at. They can launch aircraft. The aircraft may have to have some sort of tanker assist. depending on how far they go into Iran, if they are used for strike aircraft in Iran, which I assume they would be. But that's, that's all. What is the campaign? And certainly they would be in a position to do a lot of things in northern Iran and kind of into central Iran. They're a little bit far out to do anything into southern Iran, though.
Let's get to this question from Tom. Tom is in the Valley of the Sun. If the first mission was so successful, and let me just take people back to June of 2025, the U.S. did directly strike Iran in June of last year. It was during the 12-day war. They struck 3 nuclear areas that included that Fordo site that so many people were talking about, Natanz and Isfahan as well. Tom in Phoenix says, if the first mission was so successful, why are we poised to strike again, Hal?
Well, I was expecting that particular question. Yes, and we did use the term obliterated those sites. Now, with that said, it doesn't appear that those particular sites that we hit have really been, certainly not put in operation. They haven't been able to do a lot with them. They were seriously destroyed, devastated, if you will. And there might be some stuff in there that could be recovered, but it'd be very, very difficult, very dangerous to recover those radioactive materials that might be trapped underground. So in that regard, that was a very successful strike. Now, did that knock out the entire capability of Iran to potentially pursue nuclear weapons through some other means, maybe using another facility to enrich or doing something like that? No, it did not. It just hit those 3 sites. And it certainly didn't do anything to really knock out the ballistic missile or drone program because, well, frankly, that wasn't at those 3 sites. So it's a little bit of, yes, and I can understand, we hear the phrase weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapons being brought up. And then, of course, we go back to, well, didn't we just do something about that? It is, yes, the same rationale as to why we're striking. But this is to hit those things that we didn't hit last time.
So we've been kind of just tracking the movements of the aircraft carrier, and I have a lot of questions about the USS Gerald R. Ford, Hal. You don't typically park a $13 billion carrier in the potential path of enemy missiles, and they are parking this thing not right next to Israel, but certainly the last time Iran did choose to go after Israel, they sent a barrage of ballistic missiles toward Israel, and now the aircraft carrier is in the general vicinity. If this carrier is there, how vulnerable is a carrier strike group to modern Iranian anti-ship missiles and to things like drone swarms?
Well, I'm not sure that the Iranians really have an anti-ship capability or a maritime domain awareness capability in the Eastern Mediterranean. I mean, it's possible they could have, for example, maybe they got a submarine up there or something, but they don't really have a naval presence in the Mediterranean to speak of. Now, Hezbollah is sitting in Lebanon. They potentially could do something, but if Hezbollah weighs in, and they've kind of shown some actual reluctance recently to actually weigh in on this, because they know if they do, you're going to see a full onslaught of strikes coming from Israel into southern Lebanon, hitting Hezbollah sites. So they seem to be hedging it a little bit. So in all that regard, and of course with the drones, there's a lot of other things going involved. It's not a bad position to have it where it's located. It's certainly close enough where it can do strike missions as necessary to support anything we're doing with the campaign in Iran, and it's far enough away that it's not putting itself directly into harm's way. Ironically, the Abraham Lincoln carrier strike group, which is probably, certainly in the Arabian Sea area south of Iran, it may actually be a little more vulnerable to potential missiles and things like that. But I would say with the defensive capabilities of a carrier task force, I don't see either of these carriers actually being that vulnerable to anything that Iran's going to throw at them.
Get to this question. RJ saying, why does the U.S. feel it needs to lead in this initiative? European countries are geographically closer and are more at risk of nuclear incidents. Hal?
Well, certainly I think the U.S. position would be like, yeah, and the Europeans should step up and be doing more towards this. But the U.S. has taken a leadership position. We are the most powerful country in the world. and we have said when we saw a variety of things happening, but particularly when we saw the protests in Iran and the slaughter of protesters in Iran by the regime, President Trump came out and said we're going to do something about that. And that's not our primary reason that we're stating now, but that is one of the reasons that we've stated that we're doing things. The Europeans, ironically, condemn these things. They will say a lot of stuff, but they don't necessarily put military forces into those areas. The other thing I would also point out is that the Europeans, they're still, even though you have the European Union, you still have a lot of disparate countries that operate as separate countries with their own separate naval forces and air forces and everything like that. So they don't have the unity of command, if you will, to coalesce the type of forces, nor do they have the numbers that we have or the type that we have of forces that could replicate what the U.S. is doing right now.
Another question coming in from Joey. Joey asks, will we possibly see a regime change similar to what President Trump did in Venezuela and Iran? You and I have talked about this before, Hal. Let's talk about the complexity of a mission like the one that nabbed Maduro. How would something like that, and how would the logistics of something like that compare if we're talking about Khomeini in Iran?
Well, first off, Maduro was very close. He was in a compound, very close to the coast. There were just a lot of things. It just wasn't nearly as complicated to go after Maduro. Not to say it wasn't a complex mission, but it wasn't as complicated to go after Maduro as it would be to do something in Tehran. Tehran is way inside the country. It's over the Argos Mountains. There's just some serious geography you have to contend with just to get over there and to get out of there. That's the same problem we had if you want to go way back when we had the failed rescue attempt of the U.S. Embassy personnel back in '79 when we tried to do that. The geography was just daunting, and obviously that didn't work out well. The geography still is what it is. Now, we can do airstrikes, we can do a lot of things, but to go in there and to take Khomeini, theoretically possible, very difficult to actually pull off. Even to try and strike and ensure that you actually got Khomeini is very difficult because of where he might be deep underground and whatever deep underground place he might be hiding. But there is one thing I would say. There is a distinct possibility that what we do could cause others, kind of like, not exactly like what we saw in Venezuela, but could cause others close to the regime, but not part of that theocratic element like Khomeini and those around him to step in and probably take over. That's a distinct possibility. That's one of the scenarios that they're looking at, is that those close to Khomeini but not actually tied to the theocratic element itself could step in and try to take the regime. And in that case, the end state might look a little bit like what we saw in Venezuela, where his vice president ended up taking over the presidency when Maduro was gone. And so it wasn't a complete regime change. It was just they took out one element of the regime. In that case, Maduro. In this case, it'd be Khomeini and the Supreme Council. It's very possible.
Brian, with this, he's in West Virginia. He says, how does our leadership ensure this does not turn into a decades-long engagement?
That's a great question. I would say with great care. You have to be very careful. I think what they're planning now, first off, we're not doing a ground operation. There are no huge ground forces like you saw in 2003 with Iraqi Freedom, or like you saw in '91 with Desert Storm. You're not seeing anything like that. There is no plan to go in there and actually hold the ground and to do something like that. This is one where we would shape the operation through airstrikes and maybe some special operations type of things, but it wouldn't be boots on the ground actually holding a terrain. When you put boots on the ground and you actually control the terrain, that's when we traditionally have been bogged down in these very, very long engagements that take decades. Sometimes even then we can't extricate all of our forces completely. So in that regard, probably weeks is what we're looking at. Hopefully not months. You may have seen that Vice President Vance today or yesterday had talked about that this should not be a prolonged. I don't know if he used the term prolonged or long lasting campaign or military operation. Of course, the question is, how do you define that in terms of a prolonged campaign? What does that really mean? But I'm hearing it's going to be weeks, won't be hours, probably won't be days, but maybe weeks.
Yeah, VP Vance was quoted yesterday as saying there is no chance that the U.S. will be in a drawn-out war in the Middle East. That was the way he phrased it. Final question for you, and we will get to more audience questions with Alone coming up in about a half hour's time. My final question for you, Hal, is what are the indicators that something's about to happen? A lot of people on social media, they really use these open source intelligence channels, and there's a lot of different ways, and some people get really creative with trying to figure out how a potential major operation may be imminent. There's even things like you maybe have seen the Twitter account that tracks how busy pizza locations and restaurants are by the Pentagon at midnight.
That's a famous one.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's been around for a long time. It used to be that the Soviets, I think that's how far back it goes, that the Soviets would count how many Domino's pizza delivery guys would show up at the Pentagon. That told them if we were getting ready to do something. There's a lot of indicators out there. There's a lot of commercial imagery out there that's been used. Bellingcat, if you're familiar with that organization, does a lot of open source intelligence. They would look at a lot of things. But, some of the things that would be indicators and some of the things we've kind of heard, obviously the evacuation, we've told Americans and embassy personnel in Israel, we said, today's a really good day to get out of here while you can still get a seat on a plane. That's an indicator. You saw that the British told their personnel in Iran to get out. The Italians told their citizens in Iran to get out. We've been evacuating what we call non-critical personnel from some of our bases in the Persian Gulf. All those are indicators. But one of the big things you look for is what we call a NOTAM, which is a notice to aviation to pilots, essentially telling them to don't fly in this area. If you see that, and I say this because you've got Dubai, you've got Qatar, these are major international air travel hubs. And if you remember last June, when the missiles started flying, you saw all the aviation shifting and you saw some of the aviation getting shut down. That's one of the biggest indicators that something's going to happen is when they put that out, because both sides, but particularly our side and certainly our Gulf allies and everybody else, we do not want to see a mishap with a civilian aircraft, with a civilian airliner. So that will be one of the biggest indicators that things are getting pretty close. Now, will that be exactly when it happens? You got to remember, this is war. War involves a certain amount of strategic deception and operational deception. So, remember last time they said they were moving the B-2 bombers over to Guam, and I kind of scratched my head and I go, I don't know why you're doing that. You're not saving a lot. As it turns out, they flew west, turned right around, flew east, and that's where they hit the 3 nuclear sites in Iran. So keep in mind, everything that we can think of as a indicator is something that the Pentagon has to plan to overcome as an indicator in order to deceive the Iranians when we would actually do something.
Hal Kempfer is a retired Marine intelligence officer and the host of the Strat podcast. You can listen to Strat anywhere podcasts are available. Hal and I are back to doing our normal Saturday afternoon thing tomorrow at around 2 p.m. Pacific time, 5 p.m. Eastern time. We'll see you then.
All right, see you then.
Before we go to commercial, I want to read out Secretary Rubio's statement he made today. It's a little bit lengthy. I want to read it in full. Today, I'm designating Iran as a state sponsor of wrongful detention. When the Iranian regime seized power 47 years ago, Ayatollah Khomeini consolidated his control of power by endorsing the hostage-taking of U.S. Embassy staff. For decades, Iran has continued to cruelly detain innocent Americans, as well as citizens of other nations, to use as political leverage against other states. This abhorrent practice must end. President Trump issued an executive order to protect U.S. nationals from wrongful detention abroad last fall, and Congress subsequently enacted the Countering Wrongful Detention Act of 2025, authorizing the department to designate Iran as a state sponsor of wrongful detention. If Iran does not stop, we will be forced to consider additional measures, including a potential geographic travel restriction on the use of U.S. passports to, through, or from Iran. The Iranian regime must stop taking hostages and release all Americans unjustly detained in Iran, steps that could end this designation and associated actions. We encourage it to do so. No American should travel to Iran for any reason. And then the last sentence, something that Hal alluded to. We reiterate our call for Americans who are currently in Iran to leave immediately.